Hey, I think we will go ahead and get started. Hope everybody's having a good week. This will be our last week of Excel of this Excel series. So I think most of you have been here for at least one of the previous sessions, if not multiple. But what we'll be doing today is essentially putting together all of the ideas that we talked about in the last 3 weeks, plus adding some context around dashboard design and kind of giving you a sense of what it looks like in a more real world project setup to use some of these skills that we've been talking about. Cool. All right. So same kind of little guide website there. The data set we'll be using for today's exercise is similar to the last 2 weeks, but slightly different, to make sure you download the new file. And we will get into that in a little bit. The format for our session today is going to be similar to the last few weeks. So there will be a lot of sort of hands-on time. I'll be floating around to help, probably even more so. Like a larger part of our session will be sort of that work time because you'll each be putting together your own dashboard during this session. So even more hands-on time than the last few sessions. Cool. So what are you going to be able to do after today's session? We're going to talk about two main components. One is designing your data dashboard. So we'll talk about what that looks like and some kind of basics around how you can think about designing your data dashboard. This is an area you can go a lot deeper into as far as visualization and kind of data storytelling. We're not going to get fully deep into that. I have some resources I'll recommend if you're interested in getting more into that area. But we'll talk a little bit about design, and then we'll actually get into building a dashboard. So I've got sort of a sketch of one which you can follow. You can also go a little free form if you want, but we'll be using the knowledge that we've been talking about. So formatting, formulas, charts, and tables. We'll be kind of bringing that all together today. Cool. So what exactly does building a dashboard entail? Typically, when you're building a dashboard, you're responding to someone else's questions or requirements. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to tailor what you're putting together to meet those requirements or answer those questions. We're going to talk about each individual element of your dashboard, how to lay it out, how to think about interactive features of your dashboard so someone can click around and do their own kind of exploration from what you've built. And then we'll also talk about some strategies for collaborating on dashboards, iterating on dashboards, making sure they're set up so that they're easy to maintain and use over time. Okay, so just a quick review of everything that we've covered so far in the last 3 sessions. I will be doing sort of a quick review of all of this today. So if you missed one or were a little stuck on any of these, this will be a good chance to kind of fill in any of those pieces. We talked about a bunch of formatting options, conditional formatting, data validation, which we won't be using as much today, basic formulas, combining formulas, XLOOKUP, static tables, pivot tables, and then we touched very briefly last time on pivot charts. We'll be getting more into that today as well. Okay, so we've covered a lot in the last 3 weeks, and we'll kind of bring this all together today. Okay, so what is a dashboard? A dashboard for me is something I didn't really encounter until I started working. So it's not something I encountered very much in school, but once I started doing internships and jobs, this is an extremely common thing that you'll run into. Maybe some of you have seen something like this before. Okay, I'm seeing some nodding heads, great. These are some examples of pretty typical dashboards you might see in a work setting. So they're going to include things like quick stats, maybe just some big numbers or some kind of red, yellow, green indication of how the company is doing on some sort of metric. Okay, it could be revenue, could be marketing, could be any sort of topic, but whatever your data is summarizing. Typically what you're going to see are kind of a few big numbers, maybe some kind of quick summary tables, and then typically some charts. So bar charts, line charts, pie or donut charts, etc. And the reason that these dashboards exist typically can be for a couple different reasons. One can be just to provide information, kind of share information, make things transparent, either within a team or within a company, or sometimes even publicly. You might be building a dashboard to prompt action, right? A dashboard that if something is red on the dashboard, it means someone on your team needs to do something, call the customer, fix the account, right? Do kind of whatever action that might entail. Or you might just be trying to answer some questions. You might be getting a bunch of questions from maybe a colleague or another team or the leadership executive team at wherever you're working. And you want to be able to summarize information for them to answer those questions. So this is the kind of thing that we'll be creating. These can be created in all different types of software, but we'll be creating them in Excel. The good news is that sort of the skills that you use to create these in Excel are very similar to the skills you use to create them in other technologies. We'll talk more about that at the end, but this should give you an idea of kind of what we're going to get into today. All right. So I typically think of dashboards as falling into a few different types of styles. Okay. So I grouped them roughly into three. These are just my groupings. You might see others. They kind of correspond with the three reasons to make a dashboard that we just talked about. You're providing information, you're trying to get someone to do something, or you're helping people answer their own questions. Okay. So first type is a display dashboard. That's where you're really just trying to summarize information in a single place. So a good example of a display dashboard is kind of the standard dashboard of the car that you're driving, right? It's just doing some simple roll-up information that you as the driver of the car want to have quick access to at any given time, such as how fast you're going, how much gas is in your tank, etc. Those are things you really want to know. You don't want to have to like look in a bunch of different places in your car for that information while you're doing the more important thing, which is driving. Okay, so sometimes you're doing a dashboard that's just sort of that, very simple kind of summary information, ready to go. Another type of dashboard is an action dashboard. So I think of these as acting as sort of like a to-do list. Typically, these dashboards are designed so that if it comes up all blank or all green, that means the person who's looking at it has nothing they need to do. Okay, now if something is flashing red or yellow on this type of dashboard, that typically means there's an action that somebody needs to take. And then once they take that action, refresh their data, refresh their dashboard, it should go back to green or blank. So a good example of your action dashboard is this middle piece of the dashboard of your car. All right, so this might be something like if your gas light comes on, right? So you've got your sort of gas meter over here, you know, if you have a half tank or a quarter tank, but if the light comes on up here, that means that something more urgent is going on. You need to do something to make that light go off. Same thing with your tire pressure, or if your seatbelt's not fastened, right? Any of those sorts of things are only going to come up if there's a problem. And that's sort of this to-do list type of dashboard. And then the third type of dashboard is, I think of this as giving someone more of a toolbox. So this might be someone who tends to ask you a lot of questions, or another team who needs a lot of information from the data. This is typically a situation where you want to give that person their own set of kind of filters and options to explore. So a good example of a toolbox dashboard is something you might find in a lot of apps. For example, Spotify. That's something where it's going to kind of give you a bunch of information, but you also have a lot of options. You can filter, you can look at your own history, you can look at your Spotify Wrapped and see what you listened to last year, right? So if you give someone just this dashboard, they can just sort of look at it and react. But if you give someone this type of dashboard, more of a toolbox, they can actually dig in themselves. These typically have many more interactive components. And this last type is the type that we'll be talking a little bit more about today. All right, any questions about kind of types of dashboards? Everybody's seen some type of dashboard before. Okay, awesome. Okay, the other thing that you want to kind of keep in mind as you're working on a dashboard is the point of view of your dashboard. All right, so if any of you are doing sort of communications related programs, which I think many of you are, these sorts of questions might be familiar for kind of other types of communication, written or oral or anything else that you might be studying. So you want to keep in mind when you're building a dashboard like this, what questions are we trying to answer? What action do we want someone to take after they look at this dashboard? what decisions is the information on this dashboard trying to inform? Okay, and the reason that it's really helpful to think about these things is once you're in the weeds of getting the chart to look perfect or getting the table to be formatted well, is these questions can help you sort of narrow down what's less important, so you can kind of take things off and focus more specifically on the few components that kind of make the most sense for whatever you're focusing on for the point of view of whoever's going to be looking at your dashboard. All right, so one of the things we're going to be talking about today is adding some interactive features to your dashboard. We'll be getting into this in a little bit, but just to give you a little bit of a preview, these are the types of things that we'll be adding. Okay, in Excel, this is called a slicer. This is an attribute that we can add to a pivot table or a pivot chart that'll give someone access to do sort of that toolbox piece that I was talking about before, dive into the data themselves. So you can give them the option to filter. There's some cool formatting options on these. You can give them sort of a date slider. You can give them sort of a multi-select filtering so that they can kind of do their own exploration. Okay, so we talked about pivot tables a little bit last time. This is sort of a layer on top of pivot tables. It just makes them a little bit more user-friendly, kind of like a nicer design element if you're going to be sharing this as an end product. All right, so when you create your dashboard, I recommend taking a few minutes before you kind of get into your formulas and your pivot tables and just taking a minute to kind of sketch out what you want your dashboard to accomplish. All right, so what types of charts might you want to have? Where might you want to place those elements on the page? Are you trying to communicate a kind of just single piece of information? Are you trying to show comparison or a trend over time? All those things are going to inform the different types of charts that you include. We talked a little bit last time about different types of charts. These are some of the options that you'll see in Excel, depending on the version that you have. You might see a few different options there. And then this is also a good moment to maybe start doing an initial pivot table if you're not super familiar with your data source. As we saw last time, it's very quick to sort of set up a pivot table, so you can just kind of start dragging and dropping some of your information around just to get a sense of what's in there, kind of what the general trends are, things you might want to highlight. All right, so that all leads into what our project is for today. So like I mentioned, this will be very similar to our last couple of sessions where you all are going to be working on a project. This one will be kind of diving even a little bit more into that. I have a typo on here. This should say 2024. Okay, great. So like I said, very similar data set. So we are going to embody the role of someone who's working in marketing for a large network of podcasts. Okay, we've got hundreds of podcasts, and we've got some information on how much money they're making from advertising. All right, so we're in this case making a dashboard for the COO of the podcast network. All right, they've asked us to make a dashboard to track some of the top key company metrics. And this is exactly a very common sort of use case for a dashboard. Someone who's in sort of a higher level position wants sort of a high level roll up of information. Okay. So we are going to use the Excel tools that we've talked about so far to give them a dashboard that answers these sorts of questions. Okay, so how are they looking on monthly downloads by different types of content in their podcast catalog? What are our top advertisers from last year by revenue? And how is our revenue so far this year comparing to last year as far as, revenue last year compared to this year? And typically when someone is asking you for a dashboard, they're asking you to make the dashboard because you know a little bit more about the data than they do. So I will also encourage you, I'll give an example of sort of another chart, but from what we were just talking about, thinking about the point of view, thinking about the sort of client questions that you might be trying to answer. If you put yourself in the COO shoes for a second, what's another metric they might be interested in when they're thinking about their business, right? So depending on how you're feeling today, if you have enough time and want to just start thinking about maybe another chart, another sort of similar question to these, the COO cares a lot about revenue, about retaining advertisers, making sure their podcasts are doing well, right? So you could probably brainstorm some other types of things in these categories that someone in that position might want to know. And that can be a great way that you, as a data analyst, kind of add some value to the situation. You're not just creating exactly what you've been asked, but you're also sort of anticipating what else might be interesting because you're the leads yourself. Okay. So I gave this away a little bit before, but we talked about 3 types of dashboards: a display dashboard, an action dashboard, and a toolbox dashboard. Any thoughts on what sort of category this type of dashboard might fall into? Display? Great. Yeah, I think this one falls into display. Could be into a little bit into toolbox, depending on how many slicers or filters you want to add. But yeah, I think a lot of these things like top 5 or quick revenue probably fall into a display dashboard. Awesome. All right. So by the end of the session, you should have something that looks kind of like this. Okay, so the individual components of this should look familiar to you. We've created pivot tables, we've created some basic charts. I give a little preview of what our slicers or filters are going to look like. All right, so this is an example of the type of thing that you'll have created by the end of our session. Typically, with dashboards, you want sort of the view to be contained to roughly 1 screen size. You don't want someone to be having to do a lot of long scrolling, especially for a display type dashboard that we talked about, right? You're driving your car, you don't want to scroll all the way down to see how much gas you have left, right? You want to be able to see the important info at a glance. So we want to keep it sort of laid out in sort of an at a glance view. And if you're going to add some more components, we're going to kind of think about priority level and not pack the whole thing full of so many charts that it's hard to read. Okay, has anyone ever created something like this in Excel before? Not quite? Okay, cool. This should be a good time. All right. So the first thing you want to do is sketch out your initial design. What I usually do in Excel when I'm going to do this is just start with some text boxes. Just do some basic, think about my idea for my dashboard, open up a new tab, and just kind of sketch out, okay, where on my final dashboard do I want it to go? I just showed you an example of what this dashboard might end up looking like. You can choose that layout, you can choose a different layout, up to you, but it's helpful to sketch this out before you get too far in the weeds of actually writing your formulas and making your tables. So from Excel, in your top toolbar or your ribbon, sorry, under insert, you can insert a text box. I find that to be the easiest way to do this. You can insert a text box, just sort of label each one with the chart you want to create, and then kind of move them around, just kind of do a little bit of layout. You could also do this in like a notebook or with some sticky notes if you'd rather do it on paper. But this is how I usually start. So, for example, pull up my example sheet. That's our final one. More windows today for all of these steps. Okay, so I might have something like, did I sketch this out already? No, I have a new sketch. Okay, so I'm going to come up to insert in my table, and I can either grab a text box. I'll do text box right here. I can grab a text box and maybe I'll say line chart of revenue last year. That might be one component that I want to have. I make my text a little bigger. All right, and I think I want that one like right on top. Make some more text boxes, kind of do a little bit of a layout. So that's your first step. So I want you to go ahead and download the data set. It'll be from our same little course guide site. Make sure you get the data set for week 4. All right, and then sketch out or kind of like whiteboard. You can imagine we could use the literal whiteboard for this if we wanted, how you want your dashboard to look. All right, so go ahead and download the data set, make a new tab, and then just think about how you might want to lay out this information, what types of charts you might want to use for these 3 pieces of info. And then is there one other chart or stat that you think might be interesting from looking at the data set a little bit, thinking about what a COO might like to see. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a couple minutes to do this before we get deeper into the chart building, just so you kind of have a good layout. All right, so you just want to end up with a tab with sort of a few text boxes, kind of showing what you're envisioning for your dashboard layout. Give you all a couple minutes and then we will get into actually building. As you get your initial layout figured out, you might want to grab some of your data and create a pivot table. So select all my data, then insert pivot table from your top ribbon. Just start dragging and dropping some fields around. Start understanding advertisers, revenue, timeline. Okay, you can start kind of using that as a little bit of a brainstorm. Think about things that you think are interesting to look at. All right, does everyone feel like they have a general sense of how they might lay out their dashboard, just get some ideas? Okay, great. Like I said, you don't need to spend a ton of time on this part, but I do recommend giving yourself maybe 3 or 4 minutes before you kind of start a project like this, and just kind of sketching it out. It helps to have something to go back to once you kind of get into the weeds. Okay, so as we get started building our dashboard, each sort of item in our dashboard, so it might be a chart, might be an individual number, might be a table, each of those is called a component. All right, that's a term you'll also see in other kind of dashboard building software. And typically you want to work on one component at a time. So in this case, we've got at least 3 components. We could also communicate these in multiple components. So we want to pick one of these to start. So if you're going to start working on monthly downloads by category, for example, you want to work on that one first and not try to kind of address them all at the same time. Okay. It's sometimes easiest as you're sort of getting your data organized to work on each one in its own sheet. So if once you've figured out what data source you want to use for that component, create a pivot table, get that pivot table all worked out in its own tab or own sheet in your workbook. Repeat that for each of your components. And then once you've got everything figured out, then you can work on combining them into your final dashboard layout. It can be a little challenging to work on them all in the same tab, especially as you're dragging and dropping your pivot tables around. As we saw in the last session, your pivot table changes size. It can overwrite other data or not let you make that edit because it's going to overwrite other data. All right, so you're going to be using a lot of pivot tables today. Some of your pivot tables are just going to be to sort of check if your information looks right, looks how you want it. And some of them are actually going to be the sort of final table format that you want, right? So typically what we're going to be doing is either a pivot table or a pivot chart that's connected to a pivot table. That's what most of our components are going to look like. That said, if you want to create a single stat, so for example, an overall total or an average, something like that, it's also totally fine to type a formula directly into a cell and have that be a component in your final dashboard. So not everything has to be a table or chart. It can also be an individual value. You might want to make the font a little bigger at the end if you're just going to use one cell, but we can talk about that when we get there. Okay. And then the last thing is make sure you add kind of some labels or titles as you're working on each component so that you know what each of them is. I would say don't worry about sort of colors or formatting as we're kind of doing this first building phase. But if you're going to have a bunch of different tabs of pivot tables, for example, make sure you maybe label each sheet with which component you're talking about. It's just going to help you stay organized and not accidentally lose any work. All right, so what we're going to do next is do sort of a rough draft, I call it. So for each of our components, we want to kind of create a first stab at a chart. So this means kind of what's the basic pivot table that you need to make for each of these components. As I said, it's good to work on one component at a time and maybe kind of work on them in separate tabs. Okay, so I maybe start a tab. Think about a pivot table that might help you answer this question, our monthly downloads by our content category. Once you think you've got some idea of that, then maybe move on to a new tab, do a new pivot table, and start working on how you might lay out your advertisers by revenue. Okay. All right, but yeah, don't worry about layout, don't worry about formatting, don't worry about like perfectly spelled titles and all of that quite yet. But let's get pivot tables, at least for these three items. Now, this last item here, our revenue so far this year compared to last year, there's a few different ways you could decide to lay this out, but our data, so if you look at our data set, which should look something like this, all right, if you're in our spring 2025 week 4 data, you'll see you have a few different tabs to pull from. We have our shows, we have our episodes, our campaigns for 2024 and our campaigns for 2025. Okay, so with these campaigns, because these are in 2 different data sources, it might make sense for this question, comparing our revenue, you could do 2 side-by-side charts. For example, a chart of our 2024, a chart of our 2025 would be one way to do it. You could also think about if you wanted to combine those data sources and present them in the same chart. It's another way you could do it as well. Okay, so kind of up to you. We can, this session today is not about creating exactly the same dashboard I did, although you can if you like, but kind of figuring out how to use our skills on this data set to answer these questions, however you think is best. Okay. All right. So, like I said, we're kind of working on first stab pivot table sort of layer. I've got some hints for each of these. So these are each of our components. So we've got our monthly downloads, we've got our top 5 advertisers, our cumulative revenue so far compared to last year, et cetera. I have some hints here because you'll find as you're working on your pivot tables that there might be some missing pieces of information. You'll see in your data set I've left a few column headers. These are for some of the pieces of information that we might be missing that might be helpful to fill in with a formula. Filling some information in with a formula might help you get a pivot table that better displays some of this information. That's where formulas come in to our session today. So start with pivot tables, start playing around. But I've got some hints here of formulas that you might like to try that might help you out if your pivot table isn't getting you where you want to go. So I'm going to give us probably about 10 minutes to get sort of some pivot tables going, at least for these three pieces here. So our monthly downloads, our top 5 advertisers, and our cumulative revenue this year and last year. Remember that it's okay if this one is 2 charts or you could combine, up to you. So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. I'll kind of float around. If you questions about pivot tables or your formulas, let me know. As a very quick refresher, to get a pivot table into your data, you're going to select any cell in your data. You're going to select all, which I like to do is Command A or Control A on my keyboard, and then you can come up here to Insert Pivot Table. All right. Great to get started, and you can do that with any of your tabs. Okay, any questions about what we're doing before we get into this? Okay, great. Give you about 10 minutes. So what columns do we have in here? This one.
Should be matching these numbers to something.
All right, campaign one.
Oh, okay.
No, you're okay.
Oh, that's okay. So these aren't the ones.
Yeah, yeah. So anytime you get a
I
data
see.
set and you're not sure what's going on, you want to look at column headers, kind of figure out what's going on. And then the little hint here is to use the date formula to convert your months to dates. So if you look in your insert formula menu, you got a little preview of how to use the date formula, or you could Google it. And it'll show you the kind of little syntax, what arguments you need to use.
Okay.
Make sense? Your stuff, pivot table, formula, whatever, just give me a little wave, I'll come help you out.
You don't have days, right, in here?
For dates. Yeah, if you want to summarize by month, it doesn't matter what the day is.
It asks for
Yeah, all of our, any place we're gonna use this data, we're gonna group by month, so you can just pick whatever day. Matter.
bring this all the way down.
Yes, you wanna hover over that little corner, do a double click. Thank you. It's like a magic trick, right? Yes, okay, good question. So, date formula to convert months to dates. So what columns do we have in this data set? Yep.
Sure.
You're totally right. Yeah. Yes, we'll talk about that towards the end when we do layout, but yes, good question. Yeah. So when you get set up, just make sure you go down the data set or guide, and then we're just working to make it dashboard. So. Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Okay, hopefully we're starting to get some pivot tables together, maybe starting to get to some formulas if we need them. Right? How are we doing? Do we need a few more minutes? Can I get, if you don't get to number 4, that's all right, but I want to make sure that everybody at least gets our 3 components. So if you're feeling stuck, if you need a little refresher on the formula, if you're not quite remember how to get the pivot table to go, give me a little wave, I'll come help you, but I want to make sure everybody has a rough, at least a rough pivot table set up for those 3 pieces before we go too much further. So if you're stuck, give me a wave, I'll come help.
Actually, I think I was on the right path, sort of.
Okay.
So this is where I'm.
Excellent. Good. Yes, good.
And so. That I put down. So right here. Right. My savings.
Okay, so let's go back to our formula for a second and just look at what our arguments are gonna be. So. Okay, perfect. All right, so let's click on our, okay, so the value to search for is our first thing. Yeah, okay, so value to search for. Next thing is the array to search in. And then our return array is the thing we want to return. So the thing we're searching for is sort of like our key, our thing we want to match. If that makes sense.
Oh.
And so. Yes, so what we're gonna wanna do is have some piece of information from this sheet where we can go look for the matching piece of information in the other sheet, and then return is that thing in the whatever other column that's gonna
I
match.
see, so I next. Here.
Yes, perfect, yep,
And then what I want to match it with.
yep, and then which column you wanna go look for that in, and then which column you wanna return.
I want to look for it for here.
Yep, perfect. Very good, but you wanna look in that whole column, because you don't know which cell it's gonna be. so
That's
you wanna
right.
grab the whole. You just click where it's the A. That's the easiest way to do it, in my opinion.
I think in it messes it up. I don't give it the numbers, but let's see. And then so I want to get A and then to return is
What's the thing you're trying to get this formula to spit out?
the numbers, the monthly
The monthly down. Exactly. So you want that column.
back in here.
Very good.
So back to choosing that.
Awesome.
And this is what I want to save. It's not.
Yeah, and that one's in brackets, so it's optional, so you don't necessarily need it, but you could add something if you want.
So then this would be it.
There you go. Let's give it a try. Nice. Be good.
Did I have to do a stop to it? I drag this down.
Because you selected the whole column, A through A, you don't
That's right,
have to.
because-
If you had
okay.
just selected the range of cells, which I can't remember different versions of Excel and Google Sheets and stuff, but yeah, so
Okay.
if you're in Google Sheets and you had to select the range, for example, then you'd want to do your dollar signs, your cell reference. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's take a look at some of these together. Does anyone have an initial pivot table? It's okay if it's kind of still a draft, you're not sure if it's quite right, but does anyone have sort of an initial pivot table for this first one, monthly downloads by podcast category? Okay, great. Seeing some head nods. All right, so I'm gonna do a, get rid of this. Okay, I wanna do this one. Let me do a new. All right, great. So who wants to tell me what they did for their pivot table? Saw a couple head nods over here somewhere. How do I get my monthly downloads by podcast category? Yeah.
So, insert pivot table and selected the shows.
Shows. All right, so I'm on the shows and I'm gonna select all my data and I'm gonna do insert pivot table. Excellent. All right, I'm gonna stick mine in a new worksheet. All right, great.
And category in the rows.
Right, get my Zoom window out of the way here. Okay, so here's all my fields that I can use. I'm gonna grab category and drag it down to my rows section in my little builder. And then I see my categories pop up.
Monthly downloads into values.
All right, so the same thing. I'm gonna grab monthly downloads from my field list. I'm gonna drag it down into values. All right,
That's automatically so.
cool. Yep, automatically doing the sum. That's great. If it for some reason popped up as average or something, I could just click my little I next to my field and values and I could change it back to sum. But in this case, I want sum. Great. And not required yet, but something else I might do if I were here is I might sort this. So right now it's sorted just alphabetically by my category. But if you wanted, you can come in here and do a little sort. So instead of sorting by category, I want to sort by downloads. Not required to do this yet, and I want to see the ones with the most downloads at the top. So I'm going to choose descending. So I'm going to sort in reverse order. That, and then I've got my same table, but it's just sorted by our monthly downloads. Cool. Did anyone do anything different for this one? Different format of pivot table? Something else? Everyone's kind of look like this. All right, sweet. Okay, cool. So obviously this isn't quite yet how I would want to put it in my final thing, but it's pretty close, right? I could imagine something like this being on my little dashboard, giving this kind of information. Good. Okay, any questions about how we got this pivot table? Okay, all right, great. Let's move to number 2, our top 5 advertisers in 2024 by revenues. This one has a couple formula components. All right. So did anyone get to our revenue? So get our downloads and then get our formula with our revenue. Okay, see a couple head nods. All right, so the reason that we need to do this, if we go look in 2024, is we have our advertiser, we have our CPM, which you'll remember is our cost per 1,000 downloads. Okay, so this means that when the advertiser pays $23.35, that buys them 1,000 impressions of this ad. We've got our show ID, which is a number that's going to correspond over to our shows tab, where each show has a numerical ID. We've got our campaign month. All right, and we want to know what's the revenue from each of these campaigns. Now, we technically have all the information to figure that out, but it's not all nicely formatted on here. Right, we have for each show the number of downloads that it gets in a given month. And then we have the CPM, so meaning if this campaign is going to run for a month, then all we need to do is multiply CPM by our downloads divided by 1,000. That's this little formula right here. Revenue is CPM times downloads divided by 1,000. All right, that'll get us revenue, so that we need that piece of information so that we can make this chart, top 5 advertisers by revenue. So who's got our formulas figured out for this one? Our downloads one is going to be an X lookup. Does anyone have their X lookup working? Okay, let's go in the back. You want to tell us your X lookup?
Yes, for revenue.
Let's start with
For
downloads.
downloads. equals X lookup
equals X lookup.
and parentheses, first one would be the show ID in the current
Show ID, yes.
chart that we're in.
So here, okay. Sorry, okay, I'm with you. Equals X lookup. Show ID, that's our first one. So remember our arguments for X lookup are, we want our value to search for. That's what little key of information is going to go connect us to our sort of other table of information. Our lookup array, that's the column we want to look in to match our key. So we have a key, we want to look for it somewhere. And then our return array is what do we want back? Once we match the key, what other piece of information do we want to spit back? All right. So very good. We've got our show ID. That's that first little key.
And then we want to look for the matching show ID in column in the shows tab.
Great.
And those IDs are in column A.
Fantastic.
And what we want back are the downloads. So then column F.
F. Great. So I've got my show ID for this individual show is in D2. What I want to do with that show ID that was in D2 is I want to go look in column A on this sheet, find that matching one. And then once I find the match, I'll zoom over to column F and grab that related value. All right, that's what this formula is going to do for me. Awesome. Those are my 3 required arguments for my X lookup. Awesome. I'm going to get my downloads number, right? And then as a reminder to copy my formula all the way down, if you hover over your little corner until your cursor switches from white to black, you can double click and it'll bring it right on down. All right. Cool. All right. Any questions about X lookup? How we got our downloads? Anyone get an error with their X lookup? Okay. All right, great. Cool. All right. So our next piece for this, so now we have our downloads and our CPM, and that's enough information to calculate revenue, but we don't quite have our revenue yet. This is our little handy dandy formula. So again, revenue is our CPM price, which is a dollar value, times our downloads divided by 1,000. All right. So does anyone want to refresh us on how we would do that formula here in our revenue column? Now that we have our downloads filled in. What would be my formula for getting our revenue? Yeah.
It equals the CPM
CPM. So I'm just going to arrow keys over to the CPM in this row, C2.
multiplied by
Multiply. So I'm just going to do asterisk.
the downloads. divided by-
Downloads right here in F2.
Divided by 1,000.
/ 1,000. Perfect. All right. And I don't need any parentheses here because if you remember from math class, multiplication, division, all good. Okay. Boom. And there we've got my $4,361.80. Not too shabby for running a MailChimp ad on my show for 1 month. That covers my rent. That'd be pretty good. All right. Cool. And then again, once I've got my formula, I can just double click on my corner, go all the way down, and that's going to bring me all the way down. Looks like I already had this column formatted as accounting format, so meaning it's going to show my dollar signs. If I didn't do that, I could come up here, select my column, come up here to my number format menu in my home ribbon and change it to either currency or accounting, both work, something with dollar signs. It's usually a good idea. Okay, cool. All right, so now that we've got revenue and downloads, how about a pivot table to figure out our top 5 advertisers by revenue? How would I figure out my pivot table for advertisers by revenue now that I've got this data set up this way?
So I go to pivot table and choose.
Right, hang on, just move my data over here, so I can go back to this window. Okay, fantastic. Sorry, continue.
I choose. Um, the the name of the advertisers. For the doll.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna select all my data. I'm gonna go insert in my ribbon. I'm gonna do pivot table and I'm gonna do a new tab. All right, and then you said advertiser name
Yes.
into rows. So I'm just gonna drag and drop.
And then the revenue to the values part.
Revenue, fantastic. So I can come down here and put my revenue into values. Now it's gonna grab count of revenue right here, which is not what I want. I want sum. So I'm just gonna click my little eye icon right here. Go up, move it to sum. And that will change it to my sum totals, which is what I want. Now count is also interesting because count might show me sort of number of campaigns booked. That could be another way to look at my sort of advertising trend. But if I go back and look at my client requirements, so I'm thinking going back to what my CEO asked me about, they asked me about top 5 advertisers by revenue. So if I'm thinking about some other chart that might be interesting to see, might be interesting to also see how many campaigns an advertiser is running, maybe sort of average spend per campaign. That's another type of stat that might be interesting. But because I was specifically asked about revenue, I want to switch it over to that revenue column and make sure I'm doing the sum. Awesome. Okay, one other note I want to make about this. So it might be the case that you started working on this question and maybe you hadn't done our XLOOKUP and revenue formulas yet. Maybe you just selected all of this data. So these first 5 columns that we have, let's say, go here, all the way down. So it might be the case that you had started a pivot table before you had those formulas added, right? So you came here, you said advertiser name, and then you kind of maybe realized, oh yeah, I don't really have a revenue column yet. I would need to add there's no way I can get revenue from CPM. Adding up the CPM doesn't really make sense. Like I'm missing some columns. Okay, so if you did it this way, you could either go back and add your columns like we just did and then create a new pivot table. That totally works. The other thing you can do is you can adjust the data source that this pivot table pulls from to add your columns. So the reason that this pivot table is only showing these 5 columns, because those are only the 5 columns I selected when I created it. But up, you'll notice up in my ribbon, sorry, I can move my Zoom thing out of the way. Up in my ribbon under pivot table analyze, which should sort of like auto select when you're in your pivot table, but if it doesn't, you can click on it, okay? So in my pivot table, I see my pivot table analyze ribbon up here, and I see my option should be kind of on the right side, change data source. All right, if I click on change data source, I will see the range selected for my pivot table, and it's going to preview that screen for me with my little dotted line with the data that I selected, and it'll give me a chance here to basically edit this. You can see it's grabbing from campaigns 2024, cell A1 to cell E1001. Okay, I selected the whole columns, but it just sort of did a default. And we can see that column E is before these 2 other columns of data. So one thing I could do is I could just come over and change this to G right here. So I'm changing it to go from column E all the way over to column G, or I could select it with my mouse. I'll hit OK. And then when I come back to my pivot table, I see my 2 new columns appear. Okay, so anytime you're changing, maybe you make a pivot table, you realize you need to add some columns to your data set, you can always go back and do that. And then either you'll need to come here back to your original pivot table and change your data source, or you can just create a new pivot table from your new data. Either way, does the same thing. All right, one other reminder, let's say you're working on your pivot table. So we just did this one. Let's say you realize there's a typo in your revenue formula. Maybe you divided by 10,000 instead of 1,000, right? Some sort of typo. Once you fix that, or once you make any changes to your original data, you'll need to come back to your pivot table, come back up and hit your refresh button. Okay, anytime you've made changes, you've deleted rows, added columns, changed columns, etc. You want to come up here and hit your refresh button so that those changes are reflected. The only time where that's not the case is if you're using Google Sheets. Google Sheets automatically does this part. But if you're using Excel, you got to come back and hit refresh. Otherwise, the table will still be showing from your old data. Okay. Cool. Any questions about getting our top advertisers? Okay, great. All right, next up. All right, so we've got our first two, sort of the bones of our first two components. This one we might want to put in a chart format, depending on how you want to lay it out. We might want to put it in a table. We'll kind of get to that. What we want is just make sure we have all our information ready to go for our components. Okay, our next component, cumulative revenue so far this year compared to last year. All right, did anyone get a chance to start working on this one? You had nods, people want a couple more minutes to work on this one? Couple more minutes? Okay, great. I'm gonna give you all a couple more minutes to get rolling on this. So a little hint that a couple of you have asked me about on 2025, on the 2025 sheet, it might look like you're missing dates. You want to look at all the columns that you have. All right, so here we have our campaign ID, our show ID, advertiser name, our CPM, and we have our campaign month number. Okay, so meaning we don't have this formatted as a date, we just have our month number. So 5 would be May, 1 would be January, etc. We want that formatted as a date so we can use that information. So that's what this little tip here is. You can use the date formula. You can look up under insert formula. It'll tell you the syntax, or if you just start typing it, it usually pops up. You can also Google like a date formula example, and it'll show you the example. And then same thing on the revenue, we'll need to get our revenue from our CPM. Oh, yeah, kind of, yeah, a few different ways you could interpret it. This, I mean, I have. So what it does mean. Yeah. I think cumulative also meaning sort of like over time. So maybe this much revenue in January and this much additional in February. As far as like how we visualize that, we can do sort of the cumulative part in the chart rather than in the table. Could also do sort of like a running sum on the table. But yeah, I think this is meaning sort of like month over month, if you. Yeah, not super clear, but Data requests are often not the most clear, so some interpretation is usually required.
Okay, so that, all right, so this is. If I were to pull it, I would be pulling month by month, right? So like January.
Yeah. Yeah, so what your pivot table right now is grouping by what?
By the advertised.
Cool. So we'll need that for component 2, so you want to hang on to that one. For component 3, you might want to group by something else. Got it.
Yeah,
Over
every
time.
month.
Yeah, so you might, so that might be a good moment to create another pivot table, so you still have this one for that component, but you might want to make a fresh one.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right.
Good question.
If I like get like here, then I couldn't like get like the whole. It's relative stuff to get. Sheet.
Show me what you're copying. Show me your copying. Just make sure.
It's gonna. It's not gonna, the kids, they can't find the reference.
Yes, okay, cool. So when you paste, if you undo what you just did. Cool. And then if you do paste menu. down there next to paste. Yeah, sorry, go to your tab where you were gonna paste it.
Oh, go to.
Yeah, yeah. And then under your little paste menu, there's a little arrow. Yeah, so you can either paste the formulas, you can paste just the values, up to you. So this might be a good place to paste the values. Yeah, value formatting. Yeah. Cool, so now you've got your downloads and your revenue working. It's weird, yeah. Very good. Nice. Oh, yeah, no problem. All right, so one of the first things we need to figure out for this is how to get our campaign month from our campaign month number in our 2025 data. It looks like for some reason, we got our 2024 data with our month properly formatted, but our 2025 data with our month formatted slightly differently. Again, super common, and you might not have something matching exactly, or it might not be formatted exactly how you want. So very common that you need to fix something like this before you can make your dashboard. So anyone want to tell me how they got the campaign month from the month number?
So I did equal day.
Equals date, very good. This is the formula sort of hint I gave you.
Year 2020.
Perfect, year 2025.
Select the previous. Oh,
Great, I'm just gonna arrow key over to E2, which is the month number here.
for day, I just did one because like that's like how the 2024 sheet.
Great, good observation. Okay, so in our other data set, it had each month, and then for each month, the day was always one, so you went ahead and selected one. Totally great. We're only planning to summarize this data by month, so it doesn't really matter. You put them all as day 15 or whatever, doesn't necessarily matter. But great to match it to our other data set. It's a great observation. Okay, so I'm gonna hit enter, and then I'm gonna see that it's gonna format as a date. So instead of the number 5, it's gonna give me May 1st, 2025, which is a more useful formatting. Same piece of information, but essentially like a formatting fix, all right? So I'm gonna do my little simple formula, and then again, I'll copy paste it down. I'll just double click my cursor here. All right, looks like this is 6 is June, 8 is August, etc. So all looks good. All right, monthly downloads. This is gonna be my same thing that I did before. So my same XLOOKUP from this guy. It's the same thing I'll do. Great, so I've got XLOOKUP, my cell, and then I'm going over to my shows tab, looking for the ID, which is in column A, and then grabbing my downloads, which are over here in column F. All right, so I'm doing that same thing on my downloads. And then for revenue, I'm going to do exactly the same thing that we did here, which is my total, my CPM times my total downloads divided by 1,000. All right, so those two formulas are exactly the same. I'm just going to use them over in my other sheet. So I'm going to copy and paste these over here. All right, and I'm going to get a copy paste error. All right, so why am I getting a copy paste error? Because my columns are different. So when you're copy pasting a formula, it's pretty common to get an error. There's a few different ways to resolve it. In this case, I just want the same formula layout. So I can do this. Then I could come in and manually change my columns. So let's say this one, I don't want column E, I want column D for my CPM. And then I want to grab the show ID column B, that's correct. I can't remember if column G is correct. Let's go find out. Column G is a category. That's not what I want. I want column F. All right, so I'm going to come back over here, correct this to column F. All right, fantastic. And I'm going to make sure that my tab labels are in quotes. All right. Column A, that's my issue. And then right here, column F for my downloads. All right, same deal. Why are you so unhappy with me? Okay, and then my revenue is going to be the same thing. So it's going to be just grabbing from my correct column. So my previous example, it was D and G, and it looks like that is actually going to be correct once my view is working. All right, surround my here. Why are you being so cranky? Oh, D2, because I'm looking at my CPM instead of my ID. A2, there we go. All right, great. So when you're getting an error, you want to look at each of your arguments. So what I just did there is I fixed my second and third argument, but I hadn't gone back and fixed my first argument, which is looking up the wrong thing. That's why I was getting my error. And now that I fixed that, it actually fixed both of my columns. So now both of these are working just fine. I'm going to select those and copy paste them on down so I get those values all the way down. All right, move these over to my other sheet. I should really just be doing this in one sheet. It'll make this a lot easier, but here we are. All right, and in this case, I'm copy pasting. See, let me do this. This is automatically going by value. We had a question about copy pasting our formulas. So in some cases, what I just did was I copy pasted the formulas and then I just tweaked the arguments a little bit so that they worked. That's one way to do it. The other thing you can do when you're going to paste is you can come into your paste menu in your home ribbon and go to paste special. I don't have anything on my clipboard right now, but you'll see an option for paste values, paste formatting, paste formulas. So depending on, you just want to think for a second about what you want. If you're not going to be manipulating your data any further, if you don't need it to stay as formulas, pasting as values is a good way to just make sure that no other like weird references start happening. So kind of up to you. But if you're getting an error with the copy paste, it could be, or with the copy pasting a formula, It could be that maybe it's a situation where you want to paste the values, or if not, you want to go through and just check that your arguments are correct in your new sheet. Okay, cool. All right, so we just did some prep work. So just as a reminder, so what we're still working on is this, right? We want to compare our cumulative revenue so far this year compared to last year. A few different ways we can interpret that. I was sort of envisioning by meaning revenue sort of by month, but a few different ways we could lay that out. So we did some prep work so that we could make sure that both of our data sources have our date and our revenue, just because they didn't come to us in that format. So all that stuff that we just did was formatting fixes so that we can create some pivot tables that help us get at this question, which is what is our revenue so far this year compared to last year over time? So did anyone have pivot tables put together that start to get at that question? You do this in 2 different pivot tables or 1 pivot table. So either way, it's totally fine. You did 2? All right. So want to tell us which 2 you did?
Yeah, and the first table for the 2024.
2024?
Yeah, 2024, and I just selected all of them in table.
Great. Select all, insert pivot table.
And I select the dates, like the campaign months for
Fantastic.
the rows, and for the
Revenue for the values. Fantastic. Okay, cool. And it looks like my revenue defaulted to count for some reason. So I'm going to come in here and do sum. Fantastic. All right, so now I've got month and revenue. Now you'll notice that this did something kind of nice for me. So over in my campaigns data sheet, I've got each of these as 12/1/24, 1/1/24, right? I've got them as dates. But in my pivot table, it actually did some nice formatting for me. It just sort of labeled them as months. It recognized that because my data was in date format, it recognized the months and it did this little layout for me. Depending on which version of Excel you're using, I think my Excel version is slightly old, as I realized a couple weeks ago, and I need to update it. So this auto formatting might look a little different on yours, but it should do some sort of auto formatting. If it does not, you can right click on it here and go to, I think it's group. Yes, and go to group. And that should give you the option of whether you want to group it by months or quarters or whatever. If it's already doing it for you, you're already set. But if it's still showing up as the date format, that's an option that you have. Right, so again, to do that part, you just click on your row label. You can go to group. And in this case, it's grouping me by months already, which is awesome, but I could group it by some other time increment if I wanted to. Yeah.
So for my group, it's also grouped by month and dates, but it's add 1 line about less than 2024 January 1st.
Mm.
So there's 1 word.
Gotcha. And is it just blank or does it have a
It's
revenue?
blank, but it's added there.
Got it. Okay, so what that might be is, so if we look at the data that's selected for this pivot table, like if we look at mine, the data that's feeding it is cell A1 to cell G1001. And if I go and look at my data itself, I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. A good little keyboard shortcut to do that is Shift Command down, which will take you all the way down. So it looks like I've got data filled in all the way to 1001 here. So I'm all good to go. If by chance, when you made your pivot table, you selected some extra blank rows, that might be why you're seeing some extra blank values. So they're pretty harmless. We can filter them out in the final version. We'll talk about some handling of blank values when we get to the formatting piece. So pretty harmless, but one way to fix it would be just selecting your data a little differently. All right. Any questions about how we got to this pivot table? Okay, cool. All right, last thing that I want to do is just show you, this question was worded a little bit vaguely, right? Cumulative revenue, what exactly does that mean? We can kind of get into this when we decide how we want to display this number or table or chart. But one thing that we could do is treat this as a running total, right? So in January, we made this much money. In February, we made this much money. one way to display that would be for February, display everything you've made up till February, right? Sort of keep a running total, which I can do with a little bit of number formatting magic here. So under my sum, this is where the same spot where I could change from sum to count. Here I can come in and I could do something like this. I could do running total based on month. I could come in here and of course I clicked on something incorrectly. Running total, I wanted to do percent of brand. Made it angry somehow. Okay, we'll come back to this when we do our chart. Okay, we go back to no calculation then, see if that fixes it. Okay, great. Let me look at that in a second. So we can do this in table format, we can do it in chart format, but a few different ways we could look at cumulative, right? We could think about all the money we made in 2024 plus or compared to all the money we've made in 2025. We could look at by month and sort of by month in the other way, or we could go sort of running total or year to date revenue by month. So different ways we could interpret it. That's sort of like part of your job in making a dashboard is figuring out how you want to do that interpretation. Okay. Cool, we got our group by date, and then this is our 2024 data. So this might be a good moment to label my sheet here. I'm starting to accumulate a lot of these sheets. So this is a place where I might say something like 2024 pivot, just so I remember later when we go back to combine all our components. Guessing you did something similar for your 2025 data. All right, great. So same thing, I'm gonna select all my data, insert pivot table, stick this in a new sheet, and I might do something similar. So campaign month and revenue. And it looks like same thing. It's got my row labels or my months all sorted out for me. And it defaults my revenue to account. So I want to go over here and do sum. All right, cool. So this is the case. This pivot table looks exactly like this one, other than that my numbers are different. So I'm going to come in here and label this 2025 pivot, just so I don't go a little nuts later when I'm trying to make my whole dashboard. Okay, so we just did a bunch of little different pieces of work, right? We kind of got a sense of our data set. We made an initial pivot table. We started looking at our other data and realized we needed to add some formulas so that we could create the pivot tables that we wanted, right? If you tried to create a pivot table before you added your XLOOKUP and revenue, or before you added your date formula, you probably had a pretty hard time making that pivot table show you what you wanted to see. So this is where we're sort of combining everything that we've talked about. We talked a lot about formulas. In our first two sessions, we talked about pivot tables. Last time, this is a very common way that you're going to end up combining them. If you get a nice data set that's already set up for what you want to do, you might be able to just do a pivot table and be done, get what you want, call it a day. But more often than not, you're going to need to do a little bit of manipulation of your data set, which you're frequently going to do with formulas. So this is an example of how you might see these come up. Did anyone think about another chart or another sort of pivot table summary type thing that we might want to include as a component in our final dashboard? Cool. It's okay if you didn't quite get there, but hopefully as you were playing with your pivot tables, maybe you started thinking about even something simple, just like total revenue or number of podcasts. Those are types of things that might be kind of interesting to have on your final dashboard. Totally up to you. Okay. So as I mentioned before, okay. What we're going to do next is start to bring all of our components, now that we have all of our separate components in our separate tabs, we're going to start bringing them together into the same tab to create our final dashboard. When we do that, we're also going to start adding some interactive features. So if you have any of your pivot tables that you want to make pivot charts, this would be a great time to do that. Once you have a pivot table or a pivot chart, you can add a slicer, which is going to kind of set up it'll sort of pop up with either some options or sort of a timeline view of how you want to filter your data. So to show you an example of that, window here. example. So here's an example of a slicer or a timeline. So this is going to allow me to filter by different months. So I can drag my timeline to maybe show these 6 months, and then I'll see my table underneath update based on what I dragged in here. I could say, no, I just wanted to go back to January, and I'll see my data update. Okay, so this is the idea with slicers and these sorts of things. Come back over here, even my layout out a little bit. Okay, so what we're gonna do next is your first step is going to be making sure you add any charts to your table. So if you want to leave any of your data as tables, that's totally fine. If you want to create charts, you can do that. And then once you have any tables and charts that you want moved onto your sort of new sheet, you want to make a new dashboard sheet, you can try adding a slicer of some kind. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is go back to the layout that we made at the beginning, look at the pivot tables we just made, and then work on moving them to the same sheet. Now, I think we talked about this very briefly last time, but if I come back to my little draft right here, what you're going to want to do to move your pivot table. So right now you should have them in a bunch of different sheets. Up in your pivot table analyze ribbon, you have an option to move your pivot table and then select a specific location. All right, so up in your ribbon, somewhere in the middle-ish, you should have this option for move pivot table, and you can select where to move it. So in this case, I'm going to create a new sheet. I would recommend that you do this and label it something like dashboard. And then you should go grab any tables or charts that you want to put on your dashboard and make sure you move them using your analyze ribbon, move pivot table. All right, so to move my pivot table, I can delete this. I can come over to my dashboard tab and just select. All right, let's see on my layout, I wanted this one to go in the lower left. I'll just select somewhere down here, hit OK, and it's going to move my table. So it's still referring to the same data source that I originally set it up with. It's just going to get moved over. All right, same deal with my chart. So let's see if I go to my 2024 pivot, for example. In my pivot table analyze ribbon, if I wanted to add my chart, remember I can do that with my pivot chart button up here in my analyze ribbon. All right, so I hit pivot chart. It's going to default me to some sort of chart. I can change any of those with my design and format options up here in my ribbon. I can change my layout. I can add titles, etc. I can change my chart type. Let's say I want to make this a line chart instead. Do something like that. Okay, and then same deal, I can do, once I'm in my chart and editing, I can do move chart in the same way that I did move pivot table. Up here in the upper right of my pivot table design or my pivot chart design ribbon, I've got move chart, and I can do same thing. I can move it over to, in this case, I move it to my dashboard tab, and then I can drag and drop it around from there. All right.
Of course.
Yeah.
For the top 5
Mhm.
ones, so I only want to have the top 5. So how can I make
Yes.
this chart that's based on?
All right, great question. So a couple ways you could do that. Let me put this back up. Okay, so go ahead and start working on moving your pivot tables, moving your charts, etc., to the same spot. As far as your 5, a couple different ways you could do it. One is you can filter in your, yep, right there. So you can filter by value or by label. So you could do anything. You could, for example, have a built-in top 10. You could decide to use that instead of top 5 if you want. You can tell it how many items you want to include. So this is 5, and then it's just going to cut it off there for you. Yeah, good question. Yeah, so,
I just can't make them like this.
yes, okay, so for that, to do them as two series in the same table, we need to do kind of a reverse full date form for that we did before. So in campaign 2025, have this column, which is on number. If you have that column also in your 2024 data, then you can group separately by, like you could color them by year
Yeah.
and like group them by month. So yeah, so you would essentially need to do formula might just be months on 2024. Go grab.
So just the date. Skip hours.
Nice. Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, and so then once you do that, you probably also need a few different ways to set this up. You might also need a column for this one that's like 2024 in every row, and a column for the other one that's 2025 in every row. Then combine them so the columns are sort of like all in one. And then you can like do the x-axis by month and the series or color by year.
Do I like put them into like, do I do two separate first, or do I just like?
I think for if you specifically want to do the thing where it's all in one chart,
Yeah.
it's probably easiest to make another tab that's
Yeah.
called like combine campaigns. Paste all your data so it's all the same columns, and then give that a try.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Sure what I'm doing here. This Bobby shoot. What is I tried?
Okay. What do you?
Like starting with. Here, for instance.
Mhm.
It didn't allow me to choose like the existing worksheet that I had. I just like worksheet.
So you can just delete this out, this text that's here, and then you should just be able to click over to it
I
and click in the
see.
cell. Yeah, so if you click like say down here in this empty cell,
Oh,
yeah, that should do it.
okay,
Yeah, and that'll just be the upper, whatever you click, I think is the upper left corner of it.
okay, but
Yeah.
so
The chart is the one where you pick the sheet from the drop down. When you do like move chart, that's maybe what you're thinking. of. So
Okay.
move table, you pick the specific cell. With chart, you just pick the sheet because it kind of sits on top of the cells.
okay. What direction am I going in here? In terms of, am I putting the whole pivot table on this, or just what I want it to look like with the chart, for instance?
Yeah, so I would do whatever you want your final dashboard to look like. So if you want just the table or just the chart, or if you want both, which is also a
Mhm.
choice you can make. Typically, when you're gonna do that in a dashboard, you would do the chart above and the table sort of down below as like a detail view.
I see.
But you can just have the charts. You could like move the pivot table to another sheet if you want,
Mhm.
and then the chart can stay here
And this
if you want to
stays-
clean it up a little bit. Yeah,
Right,
up to you which way you want to have it. You could display everything as a table, everything as a chart, something as a table, up to you.
okay, the other thing was, how do I get the 2 years together so I could compare them? I have the 2024 and the 2025. How do I put?
Yes, so a few different ways you can do this. One is just to have the two charts and just have them side by side with each other on the dashboard. That's a totally valid way
Okay,
to do it. If you're gonna do that, I would make sure that your axes are the same so that whatever
Right.
the, which you can double click on your axis and it'll let you set a maximum value. So I would just do that, make sure your maximum value is the same on
oh,
both.
okay.
That's
Mhm.
probably the simplest way to do it.
Okay.
There's, so if you're gonna combine them, you basically wanna combine your data sets. So you wanna make a new tab.
2025 tab, I
Or
see.
yeah, and then like all your 2025, all your 2024 with the column name. And then you'd want to do a column for the month number. And then you create your table. You'd have them grouped by month number, and then you do the color or series by the year. So it's a little more,
Okay,
I already
yes.
said a lot of stuff. That's a little more
I
complicated.
understand, Yes.
So, but the point is there's a few different ways to do it. I think
Right.
the easiest way is probably side by side charts. You just want to make sure your axes are the same.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, a few different ways you could do it. You could just show the grand total for both. That would be totally fine. And if you just want to show number, then actually probably the easiest way to do it would just be its own formula in its own cell, no pivot table. You could just do equals sum of campaigns 2024, and then another one that's equals sum campaigns 2025, and just do a little text above each one saying what
so
it is.
just type in here and make
Yeah,
it.
that's totally as your components could be a pivot table, pivot chart, or it could just be a formula. You might want to make the font size on it a little bigger so that it's. Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions?
Or maybe you can answer from there, why is it not taking my max value of putting it to match the year before, which is 2 million?
Okay.
But when I put 2 million in. The first time I did it with the commas. And so,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
It
so
doesn't
no
usually like
comments.
Yep.
oh,
Good
thank you.
question.
That's so funny.
All right, people getting their stuff kind of moved around. So what you should have now is a tab that was kind of laid out like your original text boxes from the beginning of our session, but it should be some pivot tables, pivot charts. Remember that when you're moving your tables and charts, you could have the table still over on your kind of tab where you worked it all out and just have the chart on your final product, or vice versa, or you could choose to have both. Totally up to you. All right, and then remember, once you have at least one table or one table or chart on your dashboard, go ahead and play with inserting a slicer or a timeline. Okay, so all you need to do that is I can select, here's one of my pivot charts. I don't have it all nicely laid out like you guys do yet, but I can come up to my analyze ribbon and then I have my options for insert slicer or insert timeline. If you want people to be able to filter by any sort of time or date data, timeline is pretty nice. So I'm going to choose that one, insert timeline, and it'll ask me what I want to sort of allow folks to slice by. This is very easy because I only have one grouping, which is month. So I just do that and hit OK. And that's going to give me this nifty little pop-up. All right, so this is going to say campaign month. It's going to give me this nice visual of the months of the year. I can make it a little bigger if I want. So that it'll extend over. So I can see my whole year. By default, it's going to be all selected, but maybe I just select January and then my table is going to update. If I just want, say, January and February, I can do that. And then my table is going to update. All right, so I can insert these on any of my charts from I select my chart with my mouse. I come up to my pivot chart analyze, and then I can insert my slicer or my timeline. Your slicer is going to work better for anything you have grouped by like advertiser or campaign, any sort of like text data. Slicer will work better. But any time or date, month, any data like that, I would recommend timeline because it'll give you this nice little summarized view. All right, so give that a try for at least one of your tables. Or charts. You have the same option if you click into your pivot table. Up again in your analyze ribbon, you can insert a slicer or a timeline. I just play around with it. Kind of fun. Usually good to have at least one of those somewhere in your dashboard. You could imagine if you're doing something with much more complex data or regrouping by multiple things, it might be nice to have a slicer by different options. I can also, in my timeline, I can group something like by quarter. So even though my data was originally by month, I could have my slicer just show by quarters, which is kind of nice. So somebody could easily come in, the finance might be done by quarter. So I could just select Q3 or Q4, and it's going to auto update to October, November, December, which are the months in Q4, which is pretty cool. So that is my timeline view. All right, so you might still be working on that, but I'm gonna talk about one more piece. Make sure the most important piece, make sure you get at least a few of your tables, charts in the same place. If you don't get them all laid out, it's okay. But do at least one slicer or timeline so you see how those work. All right. All right, so as you're thinking about your layout, we did a little layout at the beginning of class, but once you are starting to put your charts together, these are just some things to think about. So again, we're thinking about what questions are we trying to answer? Are we trying to get someone to take an action? Are we trying to get someone to make a decision with this information? So when you're thinking about that, that should also help you inform what's sort of the priority order of the things on your dashboard. For example, you might want to put the most important thing at the top. The most important thing might be different for the CFO versus the COO, right? So just thinking about whoever your audience is, what's most important is the thing you want to put at the top. Same thing about whether something is a chart versus a table. Kind of, are you trying to get someone to take an action, make a decision? Is it something they want to filter? So these are just sort of some things to think about. And then there's a bunch of other visual elements you can think about as well, as far as sort of size and colors and all these other types of things. We don't have time to get fully deep into that, but data visualization is something that is very interesting to sort of do a deeper dive on. Interested? But in general, some formatting tips for each component. When you get to formatting your dashboard, so once you have everything in the same tab, you can do some fun formatting. I would say the most important thing is just to pick a consistent overall style. If you have 5 different pivot tables in your dashboard and each one is a different color, that could be a little distracting or sort of take away from what you're trying to communicate. Okay, so just sort of, it doesn't have to be all one color, but just sort of choose something consistent. And then in general, some good data practices. Every component should have a title. So you can do that just by typing some text up above your pivot table, or in your chart, you can insert a title or like add a title into your chart layout. Everything should have a title. If it's a chart, your axes should have labels. So make sure it's labeled like revenue, month, something like that. Anything that's a dollar should have a dollar sign, or if you're working with any other units, make sure those are labeled. If you've got a chart that's maybe broken out by advertiser or month, some multiple colors, you want to have a legend or something that explains what each color is. And then if you're doing any sort of more complicated table or chart, it's a really good idea to just write a little bit of text, maybe just like a sentence explaining what the chart is. So if it's something beyond like a simple line chart, if you're using any of the more, there's like waterfall, there's some other complex like chart options. You're probably not using any of them for this exercise unless you've done some really fancy analysis in the last 2 hours. But if you're using anything more complicated, you should type just in a little cell below or in a little text box, just sort of a quick explanation of what it is. You should also make sure just like the size of your components, they should be sort of roughly the same size. You don't want to have like your pie chart be very tiny and hard to read and then like a big pivot table. And if you have any components where you have just sort of a formula in a cell, let's say you've done just like a count number of podcasts and 502 podcasts or whatever, make sure you like increase the font on any individual number so that it's sort of like big or like a similar size to any charts you have. All right, so just some tips on formatting, and then a few last things. Typically, you want your dashboard view to fit in sort of one standard size screen. So if you find you have to scroll really far to see all of your components, I might recommend thinking about if you can cut anything out. If you must scroll, it's easier to have things scroll down than side to side. So I encourage you to add more things down if you need more time. And then you should have some information at the top of your dashboard. Again, could be in a text box or typed into a cell. You should have a title. It's good to give your dashboard like a fun name because people will kind of refer to it and remember it. One sentence about what it is, your name, your email, where you got the data from, and the last date you updated it. Right? This like seems like a lot sometimes when you're like creating your dashboard, but typically something like this is intended to be used over time. It's intended to be updated. So if you're doing this in like a business intelligence tool, a more specific software, all this stuff will be kind of built in. If you're just doing it in Excel, which is pretty common, it's very helpful to type this in somewhere as you get started. So once you've done all of that formatting type stuff, you should have something, my sample version. something that looks like this. So I did a little bit of formatting stuff. I added some titles. I made them all bold and the same font size. I added my little kind of timeline slicer thing right here. And then I added my little bit at the top, right? I added a title, a little purpose, date updated by me, my email, right? Just some kind of simple formatting stuff. With any of my pivot tables, I can come to my ribbon pivot table next to analyze. I have design, and I can choose some different colors, stuff like that. So I made this one blue, this one green, do that sort of thing. And then same thing with your slicer. So slicer goes with this one. Slicer's also green. That's just a good visual cue. All right. And then, so there's a few different ways you could do your cumulative revenue. I chose to do 2 separate charts, which is good because we've got them labeled by month, so we can sort of see that. If you're doing 2 separate charts, I would recommend making sure your axes are the same. So in this case, you can see that our 2025 revenue so far is way lower. That's okay, because some of the stuff is booked out in advance. We have more time to book those months. But if I make my top axis here is whatever, 18 something, bunch of zeros, that's the same as my axis up here. So just visually, that makes it easy for me to compare the information. If I had made this one only go up to this axis, they would sort of look the same size, which like visually would be a little bit misleading to somebody looking at the data. So if you're going to do 2 side-by-side charts, just good to make sure the axes are the same. Okay. Oh, and then the very last thing, if you want, once you've sort of done this whole layout thing, if you want it to look a little cleaner, you can come to your ribbon at the top under view, and you can hide the grid lines, which is kind of fun. So you get this more like white background. This is really nice if somebody's going to like take a screenshot of this and put it into like a presentation, or if you have someone very old school who wants to print this out, always nicer to print it out without the grid line. So just a fun way to make it look a little bit more polished, not totally necessary, but kind of fun. All right, and then the very last thing, in your final kind of workbook, your dashboard should be in the first tab. So here it's my second tab. So I would like drag and drop this over to make it my very first tab. Make sure it's labeled something like dashboards that's obvious. All right, that should be your very first one. And then all your other sheets should either be labeled with what they are, like raw data, pivot, draft, something like that. You can also hide your individual sheets. So if you want to like sort of hide all the other sheets you were working on, you can right click and hide any of your tabs that you have. So just some little like tricks you can do to keep it clean. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're close to out of time, but those are some things that I would recommend adding, especially if you want to like take a little screenshot of this and like, you know, use it as a little work sample or something like that. I would recommend adding all this stuff, have it be all nice and clean before you do that. If you'd like to sort of clean yours up, if you'd like to send it to me, I'd be happy to take a look, give you any feedback. You're welcome to do that if you like. And then the last thing to remember is just that dashboards are typically made to be used over time. So you want to make sure they're going to be maintained well. This is why I had a note about adding your last updated date. If you're going to be doing this as a shared file, it can be good to put the last updated date as part of the file name as well, so you have multiple versions over time. And then remember, if you're updating your source data for your pivot table, let's say after the next month, you go and add a bunch more rows into your data, you're going to need to go back to your Analyze ribbon and refresh your pivot table so that they pull in that extra information. If you're doing Google Sheets, you're good. And if you find yourself doing something like that very frequently, or you're sharing the same spreadsheet a lot, that's where you might be what I like to call outgrowing the spreadsheet. Or you reach a point where if you're doing a lot of this stuff over and over, you might need to upgrade to sort of a more official business intelligence or dashboard or data tool. Which brings me to my last point, which is today's the last session of our Excel series, but starting after spring break, I will be teaching a series on SQL and Python. These are the tools that you want to use if you are doing a bunch of stuff in Excel and you're starting to hit limits. You've got a ton of data, it's loading really slowly, you're sort of repeating the same tasks over and over in Excel, you're updating the same thing a lot. These are the tools that you want to use. If you have never used SQL, never used Python, never heard of either of them, please come. You're totally welcome. We'll start totally totally beginner with both of them. These two tools are very similar to Excel in that knowing a tiny bit is like way better than knowing none. So you'll get a lot from just knowing a little bit. And I'll also share some stuff that you can sort of keep learning. We'll use a really easy tool for this. You don't need to like install anything complicated on your computer. We've got like a nice editor tool that is generously been given to us for free. So I'll show you how to use that. But yeah, it should be a good time. That'll run for 5 weeks starting on Monday, March 24th. So I hope to see some of you back there for that. And then yeah, on our little sort of course workshop site down here under more resources, I have some links to things. So some of the blogs and stuff that I like. You're welcome to follow me on LinkedIn, anything like that. And then the last thing is on also your course site, there's a little feedback form for the digital lounge. So if you enjoyed this workshop, got something out of it, and be willing to send them a little note, that would be very much appreciated. Cool. All right, that's all I got. I'm going to hang out for a few more minutes if anyone has questions or wants to chat. But thank you all for coming. Yeah. Yes. This one?
Yeah, like the two, yeah, that one.
This one?
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Change the way this slicer
Mhm.
shows up. Or it
Yeah.
just like automatically.
So it'll show it. You did insert slicer for this one, right? Yeah, if you want it to show up as the timeline view, you should be able to go insert, so go back to your table or your chart, whichever you were. I suppose. Oh, this one. Well, it should be one with dates, right? Was it that one?
It was from this actually.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, so if you click on back on this guy and then go to there should be an option for like timeline or slicer. It's a little difficult with version. Let's see here on mine. It's like right next to it. Or pivot table analyze. Yeah, so if you click on your and then go to chart here.
The only thing that I have.
Yeah, insert slicer or timeline. Grab it from there. Yeah, so then you can pick your thing and then timeline is the one that'll give you the sort of side by side. So if you're gonna be doing a date. Yeah, and then do, and I would try the timeline.
Insert timeline.
Yeah, that's the one that'll like treat dates a little nicer. It just only works for date format. Yeah, so if you're doing anything else, you want to do slicer, but I think the timeline one looks good.
Thank you
Yeah, of
very
course.
much.
So then you should, I think you'd also want to put the values. Yeah. Or not your month, yeah. Do that.
Oh.
Nice.
Thank
Cool.
you so much.
Yeah, no problem. That's awesome.
I was like, so I'm in a environment.
Okay. Mhm.
And look at crops or something.
Mhm.
Like some crops. I think this,
Uh-huh.
but then some people, but it's in, it's. This,
Mhm.
like this, like just like
Yeah.
this. I think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's like.
Yeah, so for this, you'll need to do, so this isn't really like, you don't just want to like reformat the text that's in there. In this case, you either want to like add or remove text,
Yeah.
right? You either want to remove the units from everything or add the units. It's probably easier to remove the units from everything. Two ways you could do that. One is you could do a data split, which is they don't all have spaces in between, so it's not totally gonna work. But if we go to, so I would and do insert a new column to the right of this one. Let's do, yeah.
Oh.
Select H and then insert, yeah. Okay, and then select G, which is your, that. Okay, yeah, select the one you want to clean up, and then go data. And then text to columns. And then you can split your data on a character. So you could either split it on a space, or in this case, you could split it on the letter C if you wanted. So I would do next. And then I would either do space, or under other, you could type in a lowercase c. And then hit next or finish. Yeah. Cool. Oh, it's,
so sure.
you should do one, sorry, one more column, because it's gonna add. Oh, yeah, sorry, so just do a second column. You had it, okay.
Do I do a second?
Yeah, do a second one, because it's gonna, like, insert, sorry, so click on G, do insert. You'll see why in a second, so then select F, and then text. Next, C, yep, and then, next one, finish, I never did, on the screen. Okay. Sure, just say yes for now. Okay. So it's gonna split out the number, and then, just do this, so then you can just delete this out, and you're good to go.
Sure. Isn't.
Yeah, a few different ways. You could have just done it on space, right? That would have got one instead of the lowercase c. The other thing you could do is a find and replace. So you could have selected that column and done a find CFS and replace with nothing, and just hit replace all. So yeah, that would be something like this. To replace, so you get to your find and replace, that would have just said CFS, then nothing, and then replace all. Just make sure you only select that column before you do that. Yeah, that's the other way I would have done it.
do another space, find and replace it.
Yeah, usually, so like for these, right, like this one was probably like 1.8 space, but now that it's a number, like I bet it's the word number format menu. Yeah, it's like, it's reading it as a number, so it'll probably get rid of the space for you. Yeah. Yeah, no problem.
This workshop here's.
Okay.
And I kind of feel like I was a little behind all the data analysis stuff. I feel like a lot of my I guess my peers have been using like the data analysis stuff and the research and stuff. And just like I'm enjoying stuff and I'm fixing, but I just like saw it.
Oh, cool. I'm so glad you came. So what are you majoring in? Is it environmental? Okay, cool. Well, I'm really glad you came. Remind me of your name?
Right.
Right, cool. Oh, thanks for coming, Ray. Appreciate
And I
it.
also sign up for the Python.
Oh, great. Okay, cool. So I'll see you in a couple weeks then.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So that's the one.
Oh.
Check for this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's one.
Yeah, so that's the example of that sort of like toolbar thing. So like if you wanted somebody to give a look at different periods of time, yeah, you'd want to include that so that they could sort of do their own. Yeah, so it just kind of depends on, thank you, see you in a couple weeks. Yeah, just kind of depends on, if you think your end audience only wants to see that one summary, you don't need to include that. But if you think it's going to be somebody who's confused, oh, but what was it in Q2 and what was it in Q4? Then you would want to include this, and then they could just do that themselves.
Oh,
So just a style thing.
gotcha. And for this one, how can I make it smaller? Because when I do this, it's like.
Yes. Yeah. So the formatting is a little limited. The best way to make it smaller is if you just do something like switch from months to quarters or years here, and then you can make the whole thing a little smaller, just to kind of crunch it down. But yeah, you're a little limited on how much you can customize like the size.
Okay, but
Yeah.
it's okay just within one page.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, looks good. And then if you want, you can make your pivot tables green as well. It's kind of fun if you click on them and then go design here. You can pick like a color.
Yes.
So totally optional, but kind of fun.
Yes. That looks better.
Yeah. Cool.
That's very helpful.
Awesome. Are you an Annenberg student?
Yes, I'm the first year CMGT student.
Okay,
Yes.
nice.